right, so today I finished The Last of the Tribe, the epic quest to save a lone man in the Amazon. This was a really fascinating read that also brought up a lot of philosophical questions. Essentially, to summarize, it is a true story about a government agency in Brazil who are trying to locate and prove the existence of a lone Indian. Now, I'm going to use the word Indian, and I know in many contexts that word is offensive, but it is the word that they use throughout the book. So I am going to use that word. I've had this discussion with my students. We're reading actually a fictional book where the main character talks about her mother being an Indian and how her mother prefers to be referred to as Indian rather than anything else because she has her own reasons for it. Anyway, the point being that I personally just feel like I will refer to you in any way that you like or prefer to be referred to. I don't, in this case, Indian seems to be how they refer to their indigenous cultures in Brazil, or at least how this writer is referring to them. And so I will refer to them as Indian. In my own country, we generally refer to our indigenous cultures as Inuit, Métis, Indigenous, First Nations. Yeah. So we don't usually use the term Indian, but for the purpose of this entry, I am going to use Indian just because that is how the author of this book refers to them and how it seems Brazil refers to their indigenous peoples. So I just wanted to preface that in case anybody comes across this and they're like, oh my goodness. So I just wanted to explain why I'm using that particular reference. I don't just because I don't have any other knowledge that says that I should I don't feel like what am I trying to say? I don't feel like I have enough other information to be referring to them in some other way other than how they are referred to in this book. So I will refer to them as Indian for the purposes of this entry. Okay. Now that I have hemmed and hawed around that, um, yeah, I really did enjoy, and I enjoyed this book. It actually is a bit like, it's an adventure story, but that's also a bit of a mystery. And it is based on true events. And so, well, it's not even just based on true events. It is the true events of these men from this government agency trying to collect evidence and track down and contact an Indian that they have been told is living in the forests of several ranches. Now, there are laws in Brazil saying that if you can prove that there are Indian tribes living on certain land, that land can't be developed. And so it creates conflict because any reports of an Indian being found living in a forest near any of the ranches, of course, that can inhibit the development on those ranches. So essentially, the ranchers want to cut down the forest to turn it into agricultural land. And in a way that kind of impacts all of us as, as Amazon forest is going up in flames, and like that's a lot of forest that we in the world in general count on to provide us with oxygen and keep our carbon um the carbon, what am I trying to say? I want to say carbon emissions, but that's not the word I'm looking for. Just to keep the carbon oxygen ratio, in balance so that we can all breathe. And unfortunately, with climate change happening, I live in a country that has large swaths of forests that are also burning, and that is also contributing to more carbon emissions. Unfortunately, Australia is currently having large swaths of forests that are also burning. So we are losing our filter, our atmospheric filters, unfortunately. So in many ways, a law that requires for forests to be protected if there are indigenous tribes and indigenous peoples living there, that really does impact all of us. And so from that perspective, this was a very interesting read. It was also just very interesting because it did raise a lot of interesting philosophical questions about the appropriate ways for cultures to interact. And some of those questions that are raised are kind of problematic in and of themselves. So, for instance, there's a section where they're talking about they had made contact with a tribe, a very diminished tribe of 5 people, and the eldest male in that tribe had actually grown up watching the people on these ranches and mimicking things that they were doing and things that he saw because he liked them and he thought that they were good things. And so his name was Pura, or that's how I'm pronouncing it. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, but that's how I will pronounce it. The eagerness of Pura's absorption took Altair and Marcelo. Altair and Marcelo are 2 of the 4 men who are trying to contact this alleged lone Indian aback. And I should point out, like, this is someone from a different tribe that they're talking about. This was someone that they have already had contact with and have an ongoing relationship with. He actually helps them go search for this other Indian. Whenever he wore traditional adornments such as feather armbands, they showered him with compliments, hoping to instill a little native pride in him. It made no difference. He clearly preferred t-shirts and zippered pants, factory made. Unnatural colors were his favorites. Hot pinks, neon oranges, psychedelic swirls, those were what caught his eye. They tried to cure him of the impulse, as if he'd come down with a touch of the flu, but they couldn't. He was a natural dandy. From the first time he spotted ranch workers in their colorful clothing, a genie had been let out of the bottle, and there was no putting it back. Every interaction raised questions of how much of their culture they should share with the recently contacted tribes and how much they should shield from them. For most of the team members, the instinct was to shield. But where did they draw the line? If they were enjoying the benefits of a sharp steel machete, was it cruel to deny him the use of a tool that he clearly would like to use? And if something as simple as a pair of scissors would cut several hours away from the time required to make a dozen arrows, was it fair to watch him toil unnecessarily just for tradition's sake? So there were 2 thoughts that I had while I was reading that. And one, my initial instinct was, wow, how very paternalistic, like these assumptions, right, that we make. But then it also got me thinking about cultural appropriation and how, I don't know, like, it's assumed that if someone who has white skin sees something in another culture and appreciates it and admires it and imitates it, that person is appropriating that culture. And yet it's also equally assumed that if someone who does not have white skin looks at something that someone with white skin does and appropriates it and mimics it, and that they are somehow their own culture is going to be lessened by that. And it was to me it was a very interesting, and not interesting, but almost disturbing, like, double standard that we seem to have. I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't have any good solutions to it. But it's definitely something I'll be thinking about for the next few weeks. For a long while, actually, I think. And there were other questions that I'm going to be thinking about, such as isolation and loneliness and things like that this book brings up. It also drew some really interesting parallels to animal extinctions and human attempts to intervene in those situations and how successful they were or how they failed, and how and whether we should be intervening at all. Like, should we be intervening? I don't know. I don't have any, like, great insights into it, but it definitely got me thinking for sure. There was a documentarian who went with them, a certain Vincent, I think it was Carrillo, if I remember his last name. It's escaped me right now, but I will link to it down in the side notes. I found some of his videos and movies, and so I'll link to some of them. They're interesting to watch for sure. And then also kind of gave me my new favorite game, which is to put on closed caption and let YouTube try and translate. It comes up with some wildly inappropriate things it should not be saying. And and even some very archaic words. It's very interesting. Anyway, so I will link to that down below in the side notes. In the meantime, I am not sure what I'm going to read next. I know that it's going to be fiction. I am dying to get myself into some works of fiction. I had a few weeks ago, not that long ago, towards the end of last year, I was doing an unhaul, and I had some books, including Cavalier and Clay, which I had kind of put in a separate pile and said if I hadn't read them by February, I was going to permanently unhaul them. So I'm gonna maybe try this and see if I can get into it. And if not, who knows what I'll come up with. In the meantime, I am still listening to Marina Abramovich's autobiography on audiobook, Walking Through Walls. I'm really enjoying it. There's really only one reason that I am so fascinated by it, and I think I'm getting up to the point where she's maybe going to talk about it. So I'm kind of on edge. But it's been a really interesting listen, I have to say. She definitely has had a very fascinating life, and so I'm enjoying spending time with her on that. So, on that note, happy reading.